just a quick show of hands, how many of you are actually vendors? How many of you are actually end customers? Vendors? That's going to be interesting. My name is Amiram, and I'm a product manager of a nice real-time authentication, which is the nice solutions for the voice biometric authentication in the call centers. Can you hear me? Yeah, I hate standing. I feel like Churchill. Right. Let's start a war. Let's end one. Wait a second. We've been asked to share some of our experience about the customer center and how we deal with authentication in the customer center. NICE basically is a company that deals with customer centers, the whole ecosystem that surrounds it. So we've gained quite a lot of experience over the years. I would share some of this experience right now. We heard a very fascinating presentation from Matt yesterday about the use cases that he was a part of in Barclays, and we heard a very fascinating presentation this morning by Brett about why do we actually need authentication. So I think they did a good service for me. I don't need to explain why do we actually need it, because it's pretty obvious that we need it. We're going there. We're not quite there yet. I mean, some of the big vendors will offer this, but there's still some skepticism about the solution, whether it's from the end user or from the big institutes. And so the task of actually convincing our customers to go with voice biometrics is not an easy one. But once we get them on board, then the challenges begin. So I'm not going to talk about how do we get them on board. I think Brett did a nice service of doing that, explaining why we actually need authentication, of course, biometrics authentication in the customer center. I am going to touch on some of the points that Matt mentioned yesterday, some of the difficulties that organizations face while implementing the solution. And this is where we gained quite a lot of experience over the years in deploying such systems. So I'll start you off with a little, there you go.
Mom, I'm going out. Can I have $5? Sure, honey. What's your first pet's name? Huh? You never let us have a pet. And what's your mother's maiden name? Mom.
Well, you get the idea. Yeah, so, authentication is everywhere, yeah. We're getting there. Eventually, the benefits of using authentication, whether it's voice biometrics or other methods that were presented here, are pretty clear. Yeah, we saw that the holy triangle of cost and customer satisfaction, yeah, and the reduction of time, handling time. Let's look back at the history of contact centers. In the past, when you wanted to get a service, you would actually have to walk into a branch of your bank, identify yourself using some sort of a governmental ID, a driver license, passport, or ID card, and you will get the service. How many of you have visited your bank's branch physically in the last year? Did you enjoy that experience? You did. I can say that personally, I don't go to the bank unless I have to. And the only times that I find that that I really have to go to the bank is when I want to enable more services in the digital channels. If I want to use the web services, I use the web for everything, or the app. If I want to use more services like transferring money overseas or something, and I want them to be available on the web, then I have to actually go to the bank and sign some forms, and only then they will enable it. So the branch is not going anywhere yet. Some level of transactions that you want to perform, you still have to go physically to the bank. But in the years, over the years, I'm saying banks, but you know, it's true for telco companies and other institutes. They've introduced the call centers. In the past, it used to look something like this, you know, a bunch of older ladies giving you service, but you would still have to go through the whole authentication. And we all know, when we discussed the pain of actually calling, I think Brett was spot on that one. The worst experience that someone gets is actually when he has to call into the call center and authenticate itself. Yeah, all these annoying questions. Some of them actually might be not really pleasant to answer, like what was the last transaction you made with your credit card? I don't want to share that information with you. I don't want to talk about it. I don't know. Maybe it was something that I don't want my wife to know about. Just anyway, it's there. Yeah, it's not going anywhere. The call center. But even the call center has evolved over the years. Today, there are many channels. You've heard the omni-channel experience, the buzzword going on in the last year. How many of you have called the contact center in the last, let's say, 2 months? Was it your first choice of contact? Or did you try something before that?
It was a fraud, you know.
It was a fraud.
Yeah, so I had to call somebody. Yeah.
When you want to, I don't know, perform a, let's say, a basic transaction, do you actually go to the bank? No. Do you actually call the call center? You will use other means like mobile app, like web. These other channels are gaining more and more momentum, and I'll show you a slide that actually shows this. But we have different channels today, and if we look back at the history, back around 1996, they introduced the customer center. Sorry, I have to stick here. The call centers, which introduced, you know, voice channels, fax, if you still remember what that is. And then about a decade later, we've introduced some of the digital channels, email, websites, even some of the mobile legacy phones. A decade later, everything is accessible pretty much from everywhere. Yeah? Using mobile apps is the best example, I think. But also, if you want to talk to an agent today, not just use the app, then there are other channels that are gaining more and more momentum, like chat. You know, the other room is having a conference about having the chat automatically with, you know, robotics and stuff like that. But you can actually chat to a live person today. And there are, of course, all the social media channels. I can say that personally, if I need to complain about something, if I'm not satisfied with the service I'm getting, or I want immediate attention, then my first channel of choice would be the social media channel. Because it has that impact of, you know, the hidden shaming. You know that if you don't get an immediate response, then it's not going to project well on the you know, on my bank or my service provider or whoever I'm trying to contact. So that would be the first one. But the thing is, but having all these channels available, yeah, and who knows what's going to be in the future, yeah, telepathy, whatever. I just know that NICE is going to be able to record. But having all these omni-channel, yeah, there's a reason we call it omni-channel, not multi-channel. If you look at the statistics, what customer centers are using these days, then all of them have voice, yeah? All of them have telephony, and it's not going anywhere. As I said, it's always going to be there. You've heard, I forget his name, the guy who talked this morning from ESA. Even while introducing other channels, they still hire more people in the contact center, more agents, yeah? And that's still going on. Yeah? It's not going anywhere. Whereas the other digital channels, as you can see here, are getting more momentum. Yeah? Most of them are being used today. If you look at the projections for the next year, then we see that the media channels are going to be more and more popular. You know, more customer centers are going to adopt those channels. We know that there's a big, there's a trend of service providers trying to move most of the activity into the self-service channels, like web, like chat, or automatic chats, apps, but I'm not going to touch on authentications on those channels because I think there was a great presentation yesterday that explained about the difficulties of having different authentication methods in each channel and how we need to create like a unified authentication method for all the channels. But what we have learned from our experience in the customer centers is that having all these channels, you can see another slide here of the history of the multi-channel in the contact center. It's a challenge, it's a big challenge for a service provider, but it also provides us with a lot of information. A customer, everything's about the customer experience. We heard it in the keynote yesterday in the morning. When a customer calls into the contact center, usually it's not the first choice, unless it's a very specific part of the population, like elderlies and so on, which are not going to use a social. Millennials are not going to call the call centers. They're probably going to try and use other digital channels before. But the thing is that in terms of a customer experience, once I call the call center, I don't want to go through the whole process again. You know, if I started off, I'll give you a live example. About 2 weeks ago, I had to change my, internet service provider package. You know, I wanted a wider broadband. Yeah? And first choice, I went to the website and I tried to do it through the website. It was impossible. I had to talk to someone or I had to use another channel. So I wrote them an email. I didn't get a response like a day later. So the next step would be to go to the chat. And I spoke to a chat agent, and he was able to, you know, give me whatever I wanted. That was great. But then he told me that in order to close the deal, I'll actually have to call and talk to a live person. Yeah? So I did call the call center. I waited for 5 minutes on the line, and then when the agent picked up, I had to authenticate myself with all these tiring questions. And he said, sure, yeah, great, I'll be able to upgrade your package and everything, but I have to transfer you to a sales representative who will close that deal. So he transferred me, and then I had to go over the authentication process again, and moreover, I had to go through the whole explaining what I want again. So it's one thing that the conversation has changed when using authentication. It shifted from who you are to how can I help you. That's a different thing about knowing actually what you want. And going through all these multi and omni channels, we have the ability today to know when a customer calls the call center where he's been through before. What was his journey? What channels has he used before? What did he try to do? And when the agent finally picks up that call, then he knows all these things about the customer, and that will help him improve the customer experience. So authentication is great, yeah, that's the technology. And again, as I said, it's pretty obvious that this is the right technology to go with, but it's not the only thing. Authentication is one part. Voice biometrics is one part of the whole customer experience. And in order to provide the customer with the end customer experience, with a better customer experience, we need to have a system or a mechanism or understand the ecosystem around it and help the agents. Today, and it was also mentioned by Matt yesterday, the weakest link in terms of security in the customer center is the agent. If you try to log into a website and you fail, you don't forget your password, you'll get blocked. Yeah? We have other means of security. The weakest link is always the agent, because the agent, A, is very eager to please. And keep in mind that when you actually reach the agent, you're at some sort of an escalation point. You use it as an escalation. If I call the contact center, it means that I'm not happy with the service I've gotten so far. So I'm not going to be, well, I'm not American, so I'm not going to be so polite and with the agent. I'm just going to go straight to the point and complain. Yeah? So the agents, on one hand, they're very eager to please. On the other hand, they're measured by their average handling time. So they need to keep the call short and to the point, still keep you happy. So fraudsters, and that's the, well, I've got some statistics to back that up also. 80% of fraud attempts is actually done in the call center. Like fraudsters, they will use the web, yeah, probably. But if you're a good fraudster, you will probably try and call the call center. And we saw a great video of how it actually can be done, yeah. And again, statistics, if you look at fraudsters, the fact that we know the journey that this specific customer had called, we know where he's been before, we know what other channels he used before, that's a big advantage because, again, from researches that we've done, we saw that fraudsters or calls that originated in the web channel, for example, and then escalated to a call center are less at risk of being fraudsters. Fraudsters would usually call directly to the call center. And the fact that we have on the other side an agent that is eager to please, well, again, we saw a great video of how this can actually happen. And you know, personally, I can relate to that. I'm pretty sure it happened to most of you. I usually call the call center while I'm driving, you know, in my car. I don't have time during the day to call them and wait on the line. So I use my commute time to call the call center, and there's always background noise. You saw that crying baby in the video. And you see that, you know, the agent, oh, well, he'll ask me usually, so what's the last 4 digits of your credit card? That was his means of authentication. I don't remember that at the moment. You know, I'm driving, I can't take out my wallet and look at my credit card and everything. And all of the times, not most of the times, all of the times, if I'm pressuring hard enough or if I'm being impatient, then eventually the agent will say, okay, that's fine, let's just, okay, so how can I help you? He will skip that whole part. So again, the agent is the weakest link, and we, having the voice biometrics as a means of authentication is great, but we also need to provide the agent with some guidance of how to use it, when to use it, you know. And this is another part of the whole authentication solution. Authentication is not just the voice biometrics. There's a lot of things around it. One of them is agent guidance. Okay? Having the ability to guide the agent in real time, pop up something on the screen, guiding him what the next step he's supposed to do, whether the authentication succeeded or failed, whether a fraudster was identified and, you know, he needs to take some security measure, transfer the call to the security department or a fraud department. So real-time agent guidance is also very, very important. And we have found that in solutions that actually implement this, the real-time agent guidance, then the fraud successful fraud attempts were reduced dramatically. Now, as I said, usually when you call the call center, you're impatient, you want to get, you know, fast service. Having the voice biometrics is great. Now, the next step after deploying this system will actually be to enroll customers and get their consent to use the service. It's also, you need to know when to offer that consent. If I'm on the phone and I'm calling it, I'm impatient. If the agent's going to tell me, you know, ask me, oh, listen, we got a new service, it's called voice biometrics, next time you call, you won't have to identify yourself with all the tiring questions and everything. Do you want to enroll to that service? Probably not gonna. You know, there are three, when you offer consent, there are 3 answers that you get. Yes, no, and?
Not now.
Not now, ask me later, right? Again, we need to know what to do with this. You know, we've gained some experience over the years. We can actually guide the agents of when is the right time to offer the consent. Is it in the beginning of the call? Is it in the end of the call? You need to know who you're talking to, you know, because as I said, when we get the call, we have a lot of information coming in with that call, not just the caller ID. We know who that person is. We know what channels he usually uses. We know a lot about his call center habits. You know, how often does he call? What does he usually do? All this will help us eventually make the right decision or guide the agent. Is this the right time to offer consent? Maybe not. Maybe consent should be offered in an SMS campaign and not just in this phone call, right? So we have that expertise. It's knowing the ecosystem of the customer center that helps you improve that service. So consent management is another part of it. When do I offer consent? I need to know about a customer when he calls. Did he offer a consent? Did he express his consent? Did he say, ask me later? When's the right time to contact him again? And so on. And if he wants to opt out of this service, then I need to manage that and probably delete his voice print, all that stuff. So consent management is, again, another big part of dealing with the contact center. So again, it's not just about the technology, it's about how you implement it and how you fit it in the ecosystem of the customer center. Once you actually got the consent of the customer, the next step will be to enroll the customers. Now, Matt showed yesterday the beautiful graph of the enthusiasm. How enthusiastic are the service provider or the organization about that new implementation, that new product, that new technology, voice biometrics, so that everybody's enthusiastic in the beginning, before they deploy. Then it drops down when you need to deploy the service. It takes a long time. You need to have the know-how how to actually implement such a solution in an easy way, not in a lot of time. You spend all that money on buying this new technology. You want a quick return on investment. You want to enroll customers quickly to that service. And that's another know-how that you need to have about how to enroll customers, and how to manage that enrollment. So I'm a customer. I've called the call center. I've expressed I've given my consent to use or create a voice print and use this service of voice biometrics, real-time authentication. Now, when am I going to actually enroll into the service? If you're not using historical enrollment, for example, then I'm going to have to wait until the next call to actually enroll you into the service. I'm going to probably use the call that you've expressed your consent. And then I need to wait for you to call again. Now, what do you think this number is? How often do you call the contact center? A year? Once?
Less.
Twice? I feel like an auction. How often do you call the contact? I hear 5 times. Not a lot. Who here has called the call center in the last year more than 2 times? 3 times? Once? That's the average. The average customer calls the call center about 1.7%. 1.7% of the customers actually call the call center more than once a year. That's a very low number. So I've deployed this new system with voice biometrics, but I'm having real difficulties enrolling customers because they just don't call it. If you have the recording in your system already, you can leverage that. And you can create voice print. I can technically enroll all the customers that I have in the system from the go live point. I'll show this graph. This is, this one. This is actually a big bank in the US with tens of thousands of agents and millions of customers. They've implemented a nice real-time authentication solution, and this is the time it took it to enroll customers. What you see on the left is in the hundreds of thousands. So you see that from the first day that they deployed the system, it took them about 2 weeks to get to just about 1 million enrolled customers. Now it doesn't mean that 1 million customers have actually called the call centers. The numbers are not even close to that. It's the fact that they had the recordings of these customers in their database. And they have used this to enroll customers. Specifically in this example, consent is not required. So you can look at the legal aspect. Can I enroll someone without them expressing their consent? Technically, I can do that. It's not a problem. But the thing is that you need to have the ability to actually deploy the system and enroll the customers fast. You know? So that's another know-how. That's another expertise from our past experience, you know, the years of experience in dealing with the ecosystem of customers. And one of the hurtful points for customer centers, as Matt said yesterday, is the whole deployment issue. I've installed the voice biometric engine, but now I need to provide professional services on top of that and calibrate the system and all that stuff. So it's important that you will have this all as a part of the product, not just as a project going on. Then you can actually reduce the time for implementation, and you can gain immediate return on investment by actually involving all the customers and start using the system. So that's another important aspect. All right, so the next part after consent and enrollment would actually be the authentication itself. And as we said, we have several channels of authentication. Even if we do provide, like there was a nice discussion about this yesterday, even if we do provide a unified authentication for all the different channels, which is that's not how it's done today, and it's probably not how it's going to be done in the near future. But authentication is, again, just one part of it. You need to manage that authentication. You need to have the know-how. And when you deal with multi-channel, as I said in the beginning, when a customer calls, you actually know where he's been. What was he trying to do and where? What channels was he using? We can use this to leverage the risk of the call. I gave an example of a call that originated in the web service is statistically of less risk of being a fraud call once it gets to the call center. Fraudsters usually just call the call center. So knowing where the call was or where the customer, the journey that the customer took before he got to the contact center gives us a great deal of knowledge. And it's not just the automatic number identification, what's the number that is calling, or what's the gender, or all the details that you get from the CRM system. It's also the journey that is done. What was he trying to do? And this again could help us with the real-time guidance to the agent. And this could help us determine the risk of the call when it gets in, but it also will help us to determine the risk of the call if it changes during the conversation. If the call started as low risk, for example, just someone calling to ask where the nearest branch to his house is, that's a low risk call. I don't need to invoke the authentication mechanism. Asked simple question, there's no security issue here, sure, give him the answer. But if his next question is going to be, well, I want to check my balance also, maybe the risk will increase a bit. And if the next thing he will want to do is a transaction, maybe the risk will go higher. And we can identify what's going on the agent's screen. If the agent will choose right now, like a transaction, or the customer wants to perform a withdrawal of all this money, then we know how to calculate that risk, and we know to detect in real time if the risk is increasing. You know, if this is a high risk call, then you need to know what to do with it. Voice biometrics is one part of it. Sure, I'll use the voice biometrics to authenticate it, but maybe if it's a very high risk call, I will also want to invoke the KBAs, all those annoying questions, but maybe I'll invoke some of them as another means of security. And then there's the other aspect of fraud. Yeah? I haven't talked about fraud at all, but if a fraudster is calling the system and he's on the fraud list or the blacklist that we have, And Brett gave a great example of that. When a fraudster calls into the system, he leaves his fingerprints or his voice print. We can save that voice print and identify it as a fraudster if it doesn't match the original voice print of the customer. Or if that caller, that fraudster is on a blacklist, then we'll immediately know that this is a fraudster calling, and we can guide the agent to invoke some security measures, maybe transfer it to a fraud dealing software like Nice Actimize or others. So it's not enough using the voice biometrics. I also need to know, or I have that information coming in, and I can leverage it. Where the customer is calling from, where has he been before, what's his authentication history? Was he authenticated before? Was there a mismatch before? Is there inconsistency in his authentication process? So managing the authentication process is also a big part of knowing how to deal with real-time authentication in the ecosystem of the customer center. Let's talk about the future. Now, trying to anticipate what customer centers are going to look like in the future is it's a nice challenge. You know, I'm a product manager, and for me this is the great stuff because I'm the end user myself. You know? So when I call my bank and I'm getting all this horrible customer experience, that I can immediately think of how I can improve my product and try to sell it to that bank, so eventually I'll be the end users. But from a vendor's point of view, we deal with, again, ecosystem of customer centers, and we try to anticipate where they're going to go. I've shown you this slide of what channels they're going to use in the future. This is dynamic, it changes all the time. And trying to anticipate what's going to happen is a real challenge. It's also very exciting because a few years ago, if you would have asked contact centers, are you going to use chat recording? Nobody didn't even know what chat recording is. They're going to record the chat channels. Video, for example. Have any of you ever called your contact center in a video call? No. The technology is there. You know, a year ago we've asked the contact centers about, are you going to implement video channels? The answer was definitely no. A year has passed, and we got 16 customers that actually implemented video, and video is gaining momentum. So it wasn't even in their plans. So trying to anticipate what's going to be the future. Are they going to use WebRTC, for example? So it's new technologies, new channels. It's trying to make the customer experience better is what drives the customer centers. And us as vendors are always trying to be one step ahead of the customer center and trying to anticipate what is he going to use in the future. And not just in ways of what channels he's going to use for authentication, but you know, we've seen very nice presentations here about the different types of authentication. Today we deal with voice biometrics, but I had a really interesting conversation with Andrew yesterday that does the face recognition. Maybe this is something that customer centers are going to be using in the future for walking centers, for example, in branches. Maybe they can use fingerprints. You walk into the branch, you use your fingerprint, and you're identified. When you get to the agent, you don't have to show your ID or I don't know. So it's very interesting for us. You know, this is the exciting part in our work, trying to anticipate what's going to be the next step, what's going to be the next big thing. We know that biometrics authentication that's probably going to be the right direction. What channels are we going to be using? I don't know, we can only guess. But what we do know is the fact that having the authentication, or the voice biometrics, the face recognition, authentication, having the means to authenticate in a seamless manner is just one part of the whole ecosystem that is called the customer center. That's just one part of the customer experience. And it's important when you think about your products or when you come to choose a vendor. It's important that you think about the whole ecosystem, not just the authentication. It's just one part. You need to know how to manage the customer consent, how to manage the enrollment, how to deploy the system quickly and easily and get a return on investment like that, and actually save you that money that what eventually counts. Yeah, so that's it. Try to get out of time.
Okay, thanks. Good, just time for maybe one question.
Sure, of course.
We have those questions going, so I have a quick follow-up.
I have.
Yeah, what? Sorry.
Sorry, I was hitting that. So first of all, great presentation. I had a question about legislation and privacy policy. So NICE has had some fantastic deployments globally. Are you seeing differences in the legal aspect of providing consent and enrolling? I know that in the United States things are fairly liberal, but potentially in places like Singapore or elsewhere you've seen
that's a great question. Security is always a big concern with everyone, especially with institutes of voice biometrics. It was mostly because of security reasons. There's the triangle of security, customer satisfaction. In the States, which is very surprising, only 3 of the 50 states actually demand that you have consent. The rest, you can just enroll. We have a customer, a big bank in the US, so their only means of identification is the ANI, the automatic number identification. If I call from my cell phone, that's it. I'm authenticated, I'm identified, I'll immediately get service. It sounds ridiculous. You can agree with me. So 3 of the 50 states in the US are actually, only 3 states actually require consent. So if I was talking previously about fast enrollment and how I can enroll all your customers in a very short time, in those states who don't require consent, I can actually do that like this from day one. I don't have to wait for consent, I don't have to wait for other calls. In other regions, again, it depends. You'll find it most, I don't know if it will be surprising or not. In Russia, for example, consent is very strict. You need to get consent. The question is, all right, so if a customer doesn't express his consent, or doesn't agree to use the service, to be enrolled to that service, does the bank not enroll them? The answer is they enroll them. It's funny because the law doesn't prohibit the banks in Russia, for example, from not offering consent. It's like a loophole. They don't need to ask for consent. They do that. In Singapore, for example, security, we have a big customer in Singapore. Actually, it's a joint customer, so you know about it. They're very strict on security. There we find it that consent is, of course, it's needed, and moreover, in that case, it's not a legal issue, it's more of the customer wishes eventually. Because legally you just need to ask for consent. But this customer specifically wants, he doesn't want to use historical calls for enrollment, but only use the calls from the minute that the customer has called. So if the customer calls and he's offered the service and he's expressed consent, only from then on you can use his calls for creating the voice print and using the service. Now the problem is this, if I'll take you back to this slide. What are the chances that he's going to call again in the near future? Very low, especially in Singapore, by the way. Singapore is has a very high adoption rate in digital channels, very high. So you have this great system, you've invested so much money, so much effort into deploying it, and then you can't really show an ROI because nobody's actually calling it. But it varies, and you need to have the ability to deal with it. As I said, it's not just the consent. It's not just ticking a box. Okay, he said yes. It's all right. What happens if he says no now, and then he says yes again? And if he said ask me later, which is very common by the way, especially in the States, when do I ask him later? So if I have that whole mechanism about consent management, I know when the customer has called and that he said no for consent, then probably the next call I will guide the agent not to ask for consent again. That will just be bad customer experience. But if I flag this as ask me later, then the next call that the customer comes in, the agent will get a guidance. Last time he said ask me later, offer it to him again. I don't even have to wait for his call, because I do have that statistics in the system. I know which customers said ask me later. I can generate a campaign. I can give you, the service provider, those details and say, right, go ahead, generate some sort of a campaign. And then even I don't have to get the consent on the voice call itself. I can get the consent using SMS, for example, or web. I need to have the ability in the system, which we do, to actually manage that consent, even if it comes from other channels, not just the voice. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Just one more follow-up, and then I can get going. But you mentioned agents being such such important weak link, or the important link as far as this goes, and you just kind of went through that as far as agent training and understanding when to offer guidance and consent. I think it's extremely interesting, and from a diplomat standpoint and how it works. And you guys have data on that. And Brett had mentioned some of the statistics when it comes to agents. Not enjoying the experience, but they actually get better. They enjoy the job better because of the fact that they're able to either not have to ask questions, or maybe they're providing this guidance. It might be anecdotal, but like, do you have any information from the deployments you guys have done from understanding of what they're doing?
We do. As I said, we've gained quite a lot of experience from customer centers. So we have a lot of information to share, and we're happy to share it. With customers. This is our expertise. So whether to guide an agent, if this is when's the right time, for example, to offer consent? Is it in the beginning of the call? Is it in the end of the call? What do you think? Beginning?
Yeah.
Beginning. End?
Beginning.
Depends. That's always the answer. It depends. It depends who you're talking to. And here's some statistic, it might not be politically correct, but a lot of people who actually call the call centers are, let's say, not millennials, right? They're not going to use the digital channels. They're going to call the call center because this is what they're used to, this is what they've always done. When they're being asked for consent in the beginning of the call, then the percentages are usually higher than those saying no, or ask me later. Because they have called, they have waited on the line, and you know what, they've been authenticated seamlessly. I'll be optimistic. But they want to get going, when a customer calls, especially those kind of customers that I'm talking about, the first thing that they do is that they start, talking, hi, listen, I want to know how much, I'm not going to stop them from the agent point of view. It would be wrong to stop them and say like, wait, before we start, can I please ask you, we just eliminated the need to stop them before they start talking and authenticating, so I'm not going to offer them consent at this point, at the beginning of the call, in that specific use case. Other use cases, it would be fitting to do that in the beginning of the call, because at the end of the call, the customer just wants to hang up and go. So it all depends on what the organization defines, or what customers. This is what I was saying. When a customer comes in, when a call from a customer comes in, we know the details about him, but we also know his behavior in the contact center. We know what channels he was in. It's not just a matter of age and gender and how often does he call the call center. We also know what he's trying to do in the call center. And that will give me better knowledge in real time to guide the agent, do I want to offer consent at the beginning of the call or in the end of the call? And Brett showed some great statistics about agent adoption, how agents are happy to use this service. There's the other side of that coin. As we are, I said in the beginning, as much as customers are, or organizations are skeptical about using voice biometrics, as in any other groundbreaking technology, the end customers themselves are more skeptical, especially with that population that I was talking before. I mean, I've heard some really funny things when listening to calls where you offer consent. Things like, so if you take my voice print, how am I going to talk? You're going to steal my voice. So things like that. So people are very skeptical. It's, you know, it's like in any other new technology, like we've all mentioned voice print. How many of you have actually concerned that Apple or whatever phone company you're using have your voice print, sorry, your fingerprint in their database? I'm not really happy that, you know, Apple has my fingerprint in their database. I don't know what they're going to be using it. And I'm one of the early adopters of new technology. I think about late adopters. So they're very skeptical about using the service, about what you're going to do with their voice print. And it's totally irrelevant that voice print is something that is encrypted and you can't do anything outside of the context of the system. But they're still skeptical. So you need to know when to offer the consent. You need to know, do I want to approach this again? Talking about that new technology and so on. I also need to tell, I can also tell the agent what to say, not just offer them consent. Maybe explain a little bit about what is voice biometrics. If this is a specific customer that I can identify as a skeptical customer or belongs to that part of the population who is usually not adopters of new technology, then I can actually guide the agent about, you know, give him a short explanation about what voice biometrics is, how safe it is, and so on.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right? So just to counter the other side of the agent, we actually found out that agents, they love it when it happens, but they're very skeptical in adopting it also, because they need to learn a new expertise, which is offering something new to a customer. These are not sales agents, usually. So they're not used to trying to convince a customer about a service. So they're very skeptical in the beginning, and you can see that because you have all the statistics about the agents, how many agents offered consent, how many got consent, how many got asked me later. And it's not just a matter of average handling time, which you also know about the agent. It's not the straight correlation between agents that have shorter calls that they don't offer consent. You can actually pinpoint, if you drill down and investigate the agent itself, you can pinpoint why it actually happened. I mean, why did he not offer consent? And it's not necessarily because the call was too short. Maybe because it's the agent who's not really comfortable or confident enough to use that service. Okay. You can listen to his calls and actually know that.
Yeah, that's part of the challenges. So, well, thanks, Amiram.